Good afternoon, guys. Our presentation is Black Lives Matter and What Defines Terrorism. My name is Pryanna Alper, and in my group there's Christian Fronk, Natalie Ngong, and Chris McCarthy. So, our article. So, it's Frederick Paul Graney, a priest in Detroit, voiced his thoughts about Black Lives Matter movement during his homily, and we've chosen to examine these statements due to their similarity to those voiced by other media groups and because of the controversy that it has in society today. These allegations are as such. As seen by the bullet points, Graney claims that BLM wants to destroy America. He describes each protest as riots that are eventually going to break down the system and rebuild it into something that's worse. To support his claim, he compares BLM to Al Qaeda and argues that the fight against discrimination, or what he calls the fight for justice, freedom, and love, is a cover for BLM's real intentions, which are to destroy America.
Yeah, so there's several issues with this argument from Graney. Um, it's flawed in a few fundamental ways. First off, Graney fails to acknowledge the concept of conflict theory, which we talked about in class before. In terms of the theory, Graney is a proponent of the dominating structure, as he's a white male in a society dominated by those of a social position, primarily like his own. So, in the interest of maintaining his power, he attempts to delegitimize BLM, making them out to be a powerful and terroristic. However, conflict theory refutes this categorization for reasons we'll see later on. Um, Second, the categorization of BLM as terroristic doesn't work, as the violence is not perpetuated for radical, unprovoked reasons. Instead of happening in isolation, the riots are the result of some kind of provocation from the dominating structure, such as law enforcement. Third, the violence is the result of the lack of efficacy from purely peaceful demonstration and stems from the continued systemic oppression despite call for change peacefully. Lastly, Graney is flawed in his assertion that the goal is to tear down America slash law enforcement, as it's not, but rather to fix an unjust structure, one that is not the product of a few bad apples per se, but is fundamentally flawed. In essence, Graney is making claims with no basis and no sociological understanding as for the why behind the movement. And that leads us into our first sociological contribution, which is conflict theory. As I said before, Graney is a white male, and he's part of the dominating structure, a structure, like I said, primarily composed of white males, those like him. And in terms of conflict theory, he benefits from delegitimizing a movement that threatens the power structure, as he's on the side of the oppressors. As such, he mistakenly portrays BLM as being a group that is dangerous and terroristic due to their deviance from the structural norm. However, from conflict theory, we know that those labeled deviant are often not the most powerful, but often the most oppressed. Not often the most dangerous, but often the least powerful, and are labeled as such to maintain the power balance. BLM and those they advocate for fit this description as supported by the evidence of oppression in America. Two prominent examples are the incarceration rates and police brutality. For example, black men have a 20% cumulative chance over their lifetime of being incarcerated in comparison with white men who have a 3% chance. Similarly, black children have a 50.5% chance of seeing their fathers taken to prison before their 14th birthday. Police brutality also shows an alarmingly oppressive pattern, with black men having a 25% chance of police violence upon a stop, whereas white men have a less than a 15% chance. Black youths are also 50% more likely to have a gun drawn on them, while white youth, than white youth, 50% more likely than white youth. Um, Finally, the black homicide rate is 7 times that of the white homicide rate. So yeah, Graney portrays those who are against his agenda as being dangerous, and because they threaten his power. But when in reality, they're the most oppressed and the least powerful, as conflict theory suggests.
That leads us into sociological contribution number two, terrorism and the myth of riots. So first we have to look at what terrorism actually is. Mariana Merrick Yamamoto, in her essay, What is Terrorism?, terms it a non-state attacker who uses violence and the threat of violence against non-combatants/property to affect third parties and elicit responses from them to advance political goals. This definition doesn't seem to preclude Black BLM from being a terrorist group. However, we have to consider the fact that the very people BLM takes issue with are the ones tasked with both A, enforcing their civil right to protest, and B, direct combatants against protesters whose civil rights they've sworn to uphold. We also need to consider the political connotation of the word terrorist. This term is assigned by the government, and as such, there can be a politicizing of the labeling of terrorist. A prime example of that can be seen with the Trump administration's recent classification of Antifa as a terrorist group, while according to the New York Times, there is no great deal of evidence that this is both a collected organization with membership that is consistent or even a terrorist organization at all. We must be careful in the utilization of the term. As a result, in order to accurately categorize collective groups who directly threaten national security, and there does not seem to be enough evidence to place this term on Black Lives Matter. We must also consider who can be termed combatants in this situation. According to Gilham and Marx, in the escalation of violence, police serve to increase violent acts rather than decrease them. This is related both to the violation of protesters' civil rights, alongside the active fear that police promote among protesters. McGuire 2018 even found that the gear that police typically wear to protest, such as riot gear, actually acts to promote violence by increasing fear among protesters. Rightfully so, since Gilham and Marx also saw that the police since 9/11 have increasingly been more violent with protesters due to the increased protections afforded to law enforcement following the terroristic attack of 9/11.
That brings us to sociological contribution number 3, the failure of peaceful protests and like where we are today because so the victory of passing the Civil Rights Act in 1964 was accomplished despite the mounds of violence, but not from the peaceful protesters, from the police. Before the Civil Rights Act was passed, Martin Luther King was a key leader in leading peaceful protests, such as the massive one held in Birmingham. As the youth fought for a better and equal future, they were attacked viciously by police dogs and fire truck hoses. The conventional idea that the civil rights movement and the nonviolent protest changed everything is clearly incorrect. Police violence still remains. In addition to the previous statistics mentioned, according to the U.S. Police Shooting Database, throughout the past decade, Black people have been 25% of those killed by the police in 2020, despite only being 13% of the population. Here's a question. If you've been continuously poked with a stick and you've asked a person to politely stop and they haven't, would you just sit there and take it for the rest of your life? Why are the protesters supposed to suppress their impulses to react with violence when the same standard isn't expected with trained police officers? As said by Dudson Howells, an associate professor of political science at LSU, even among those who use nonviolent techniques, the conventional wisdom that physical violence is necessary under certain circumstances often prevails, which proves that the violence used in these protests isn't wrong because they've been oppressed for so long and they need to be able to vocalize their struggle.
Sociological contribution number 4 is the individualistic fallacy. The individualistic fallacy pertains to the way the pastor views the police. He views the police in a positive light, and any wrongdoing can be explained by a few bad apples. This view divides people into two groups, good and bad, with the cops as the good guys and Black Lives Matter as the bad guys. This becomes harmful because once you view someone as good, you will look for any excuse to justify their actions. The pastor draws back to the 9/11 comparison. The cops who responded to 9/11 became heroes for their actions, and rightfully so. However, it is incredibly unfair to compare the NYPD at their finest to the majority of cops now. Cops are still capable of doing wrong and being racist, even if they are good people. Police brutality is a systemic issue that leads officers into behaving this way. We cannot excuse their actions by shifting all the blame onto the individuals when it is the society's fault as well.
So next we go into the sociological significance. So Father Paul Graney fails to recognize with his statement several key arguments about and falls into many sociological fallacies because of it. Number one, the individualistic fallacy. As mentioned by Chris earlier in the presentation, we cannot assume that all police officers are seeking to serve the community, and that the good behavior of one police officer justifies the inappropriate conduct of the rest. Additionally, assuming that Black Lives Matter protesters are all violent when 93% of protests have been proven to be nonviolent does not make any sense by the pre-Stone argument. Number two, terrorism is designated as such by the state. Not only is it inappropriate to point to BLM as a terrorist group, it is also not fair to say that BLM is solely responsible for the violence, and failing to look into the key changes to civil liberties that have been made since 9/11 that have led to police to be able to escalate violence and violate protesters' civil liberties. Number three, he is additionally speaking out against a political issue as a member of the clergy, and as a white man who has considerable influence over his parish and as a member of the dominant party, without providing any of the underlying issues that lead to rioting. They are continued frustration with the government, violation of the civil rights of protesters, without actually speaking or acknowledging the position of Black people in America, as mentioned earlier by Christian. Using his position and his power as a member of the church to spread a message that frankly ignores the underlying causes of this case, both misrepresents BLM and continues his misunderstanding of both the motives of Black Lives Matter and the violence that supposedly results from it.
In conclusion, Black Lives Matter should not be compared with the terrorist groups responsible for 9/11. They are fundamentally different groups with different intentions for the country. While many protests have turned violent, approximately 7%, Black Lives Matter should not be held solely accountable. The police play their part in escalating violence in the protests as well. Many of the protests have been peaceful, but they did not produce any results. The protesters have to show far more restraint than the police officers who are trained to uphold civil liberties. Police are susceptible to systemic issues as all people are, and their actions are not the result of a few bad people, but good people pressured into bad decisions. The pastor is speaking from a position of power, and we should question his motives for denouncing the minority group. He views Black Lives Matter only as a threat to him and cannot sympathize with the struggles that poor minorities go through.
And these are our sources. Any questions? No? All right. Guess we're good.
That was really good. Good job.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Stop the share.
Thanks, John.